Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about sexual reproduction in plants, and in particular in angiosperms. And here's this picture of this beautiful silhouette of a mighty oak tree here in the savanna of California. And what I want to say about that is that it's often been said that the oak is the acorn's way of making more acorns. Interesting. I want you to think about that as we begin our conversation today about sexual reproduction in plants. And so here's a picture of an acorn, and here are some leaves of the oak tree. Now this is the seed, the acorn is, and in a sort of a Darwinian sort of view of life, reproductive fitness is measured by how well in which the organism is contributing its genes into the next generation or gene pool. And so sexual reproduction is not the sole means of doing that. I mean, as we talked about in a previous video, asexual reproduction can also cause the plant to propagate. But this is the mating of male and female to produce a seed, like for example here in the acorn, that is genetically different from the parent plant, and there's some advantages to that. It can maybe survive against different kinds of pathogens, and it can also survive different environmental conditions. The seed can remain dormant until the environmental conditions are right. So there's many cool things. So one of the most important terms that we're going to talk about in this particular discussion about sexual reproduction is this whole idea of sporophyte and gametophytes. Now, the sporophyte is the conspicuous plant that you're familiar with, the shoot, the leaves that produces the flower. The gametophytes are the particular cells of male and female that are haploid. And in the male, the male gametophyte is the pollen, and in the female, it's the embryo sac, which is found inside the ovule, which is located inside the ovary. And so that may not be totally clear, but we'll get to that. So sporophytes make the gametophytes. The gametophytes then fuse together in fertilization, which produce another sporophyte. So in that case, there's alternating life cycles in the plant, going from the haploid gametophyte, then they fuse together in fertilization to make the zygote, which is the diploid first cell of the sporophyte, and then that divides through mitosis to produce the large sporophyte. And so this diagram is really helpful when it comes to this conversation. So let's start right here and inside the flower. These are the male structures known as the stamen. They're held up by this is the filament, and this is the anther, which produces pollen. Pollen is the haploid male gametophyte right there. So this is the male, and what it does is it lands on the female. This is the female structure here. It's called the pistil or the carpel. The sticky area called the sticky stigma. And then, believe it or not, the pollen forms tubes that actually penetrate down into the style and then into the ovary where the ovules are present. This whole structure is the ovule. It enters in a little hole called the micropyle, and then fertilization takes place. And the egg is fertilized right here. Now, this whole structure inside the ovule, I won't get into it in this particular slideshow, but in a future one, you can look forward to that. There's a grouping of 8 cells inside the ovule, which is called the embryo sac, 8 cells, and one of them of which is the egg. So the egg is fertilized, which produces the zygote. So this is the first diploid. Do you notice here it's colored in sort of peach? It's the first diploid, and it's going to grow through mitosis to produce an embryo. So this is the baby plant, or the baby sporophyte right there. And then it's enclosed by a seed coat. And so where is the seed? The seed is located, if you will, the seed comes from the developing ovule. The seed is then located inside the ovule, which is located inside the swollen ovary, which is going to become the fruit. And so if you pull the seed out right here, this will eventually, when planted, will grow its root system and its shoot system, and it'll begin to grow up like this. This is a sporophyte, and then it'll become a large sporophyte, mature, big root system. Look at these branches, and then it'll have its own flowers. So this is the sporophyte, the plant that makes the spores. And then these are the gametophytes, the pollen and the embryo sac. I'll get more into what I mean by spores turning into gametophytes in a later discussion. And so angiosperm, the sporophyte, is sort of the dominant thing. This is the plant that we see that's conspicuous. And so over evolutionary time, the gametophytes have been kind of reduced, comparatively speaking. And so in angiosperm, the reproductive organ is the flower. It's the main area where gametophytes are produced. And so pollination is a word that means that the male gametophyte is being transferred to the female gametophyte. Now that can be self-pollination within the same flower or cross-pollination, and that's either aided by wind or animals. And there's all kinds of pollinators that will help bring the pollen to the female embryo sac where fertilization takes place. Fertilization takes place in the ovary, and more particular in the ovule inside the ovary. And then as we saw in the diagram, the seed sort of develops inside, which is the new sporophyte, and then it'll develop its own seeds in the future. And so here's a picture of an insect that's helping to pollinate or transfer the male gametophyte right there. And so let's talk a little bit about flowers. We'll talk about their anatomy and a little bit about their physiology. So first off, these beautiful, colorful petals right here on the outside are to attract pollinators. And so not only are they different colors, different pigments in these sort of modified leaves in their vacuoles, that helps to attract pollinators. But they can also attract pollinators by producing wonderful fragrance. They can also be attracting pollinators by producing sugary nectar. And all these things attract animals to help pollinate. Not only do they attract animals to help pollinate, but once, and we'll talk about this later, once the fruit is formed, which is from a developing ovary, the fruit is very sugary, and it has very fragrant, and it's conspicuously colored, often round, and that also attracts animals to help seed dispersal. And so here's a typical flower, if there is such a thing. There's so many different kinds. It makes things really interesting. So the petals are bright coloration. These sepals right here are leaves that surround the petals and protect them. The receptacle is the base of where it attaches to the petiole right here. The female structure right in the center is known as the carpel, but it can also be called the pistil. It's composed of a sticky stigma, a style, and an ovary which contains more than one, usually ovules, so they're not all shown in there. And then many male structures, so there's more numerous stamen, and those are anthers. The anther is where meiosis takes place, produces the pollen, and the filament holds the anther up, and it's the ovule where meiosis takes place to produce the embryo sac. Here's some pictures of some flowers. You can see that the male stamen are kind of dominant. You can see there's many of them right there. And so the sepals and the petals are non-reproductive, but they're important. The sepals protect the bud, if you will, and the petals are brightly colored to attract pollinators. Let's take a look here. I have a little short video. This is kind of something that you're already familiar with, I know, but I just wanted to cover it. It's kind of cool. Here are the sepals right there, and they're protecting the petals. And like, for example, in the morning, this is obviously time lapse, and you can see when the blossom opens, you can see the many anthers that are present right there. So I wanted to show you there. And then this is kind of a cool one too. This is showing the whole development of the sporophyte. First thing that emerges are these embryonic leaves like that come out of the soil, and then they're growing up like this. Again, time lapse. So this is the sporophyte. It's diploid. It's moving up as it grows. You can see this here. It's getting a little taller. What's interesting is a little discussion about primary growth. the growth is occurring here in the shoot. It's not growing at the base. And so eventually you'll see little flowers beginning to emerge right here. And then you can see all of the reproductive structures. Let me pause it for a second. You can see here in the center is the female. So stigma-style ovary, which is making the carpel. And then here are the many different anthers, which are producing the pollen held up by the filaments. And there's the sepals that were protecting that a moment ago. So it's kind of neat. And then you can see it here. Here's a person who's taking sort of like a little brush and transferring pollen. This is what pollen looks like under the scanning electron micrograph. You can transfer pollen to the female. Let me just pause that and rub it over here on the stigma. And then what will happen is a pollen will form a tube that will travel down the style. And I know that sounds a little bizarre, but let me show you this. I'll come back to this in a future video, but I find this kind of remarkable. This is pollen. So not a seed, this is pollen, the male gametophyte. And so the pollen is capable of producing these tubes. They sort of look like little worms or roots that are extending from the pollen. So it's literally known as the pollen tube. And what's going to happen is the nuclei of the pollen, the generative cell, and the pollen tube cell will travel down these tubes. You're like, well, what's the story with these tubes? What's going on with these tubes? What is a pollen tube? Well, again, back over here, the pollen tube is needed because the tube needs to come all the way down the style and go into the ovary so that fertilization will take place in the ovule. And so check this out. Once fertilization takes place, the ovule will develop into a fruit. In this case, it's not so fleshy, it's a pod, and then inside are the seeds. And those are the future sporophytes. And again, these are genetically different, potentially, from the parent, because it's sexual reproduction. So that's what I wanted to say about that. Let's go back to the notes, if you don't mind. Come up over here. And so, again, here's a cool picture of the petals and the sepals. More of a discussion of flower parts, if you don't mind. I mentioned that the female is often called the carpel, but it can also be called the pistil. And stigma-style ovary went inside the ovule. Inside the ovule is where the female gametophyte is located, called the embryo sac, a group of 8 cells. And then up here, A, is the anther, which is the house of spores, which is going to be producing the male gametophyte pollen. Okay, and then again, another diagram of a lily. It's all kinds of fascinating structures that flowers have. These little dots could potentially attract pollinators as well. And here we are. So here's the pistil, here's the ovule. And then there's all kinds of pollinators that are called into being. Like, for example, this is a beautiful hummingbird. And so pollination unites the male and female gametophytes. And usually animals, whether they be insect or birds, help to pollinate. And so that's a great example of symbiotic relationship between plants and animals. Isn't that incredible? Angiosperms and animals getting together. Look at this, they're coevolution. Notice how the petals are elongated here, and so the hummingbird has this long beak that allows it to go in there and suck the nectar, but it also helps to pollinate. Great example of how biological selection causes 2 separate organisms to co-evolve to work well together in a mutualistic symbiotic relationship. Fabulous. And so here's the pollen, and we saw that tube on YouTube. It's kind of funny. The tube comes down the style, and it goes into the ovule right in here. And so ultimately, it'll fertilize the egg, which becomes the zygote, which then becomes the embryo, and then the embryo is going to be enclosed in a seed, and then the seed is inside the fruit, and that's either blown away or an animal comes along and eats the fruit and helps to disperse the seed. And so, not all flowers Okay, maybe you didn't know this. Not all flowers are considered to be complete flowers, meaning having all 4 of the organs. Some of them are incomplete. So they don't have all of the structures. And so let's talk about that briefly. So botanists used to call flowers that had both male and female structures on them perfect, but that sort of implies, gives a subjective approach to something that, those plants that don't have stamens and carpels on them are considered to be imperfect. That's kind of a little harsh when those plants are doing quite fine on their own. So if you're bisexual, you have both male and female, but if you're unisexual, meaning that some flowers have only stamen. Look at this. Some flowers only produce males, so they're male flowers. And then some will only produce carpels. How about that? They're carpellate or staminate. I'm not sure if you knew that. They're unisexual flowers. Now check that out. So there's staminate ones, only producing stamen. There's carpellate, only producing the female. And then this is your sort of your bisexual one, right here, producing both male and female. Now what's the significance of this? Well, I'm not sure if you knew this, but corn, you got to be familiar with corn, but corn has these tassels on the very top of the plant. Do you see this? The tassels are the anthers or the staminate flowers. They're the ones producing the pollen, whereas the ears are the carpellate. And so those are on separate locations, but on the same plant. Separate locations, not in the same flower, but the same plant. So if it's on the same plant, we call it monoecious, like one house. And so that's kind of cool, don't you think? So I'm not sure if you knew that these strings, and people get annoyed when they're eating corn. They start doing they remove the husks here, and these are the styles right here, and all the tips are the stigma. So this is where the pollen is being produced. So if you wanted to fertilize this, you'd have to get some pollen over here and then rub it over here, and all the pollen sticks. Then the pollen tubes form and go down there and fertilize all of those seeds, which is what the corn is. And so, I don't know. So dioecious is a plant that is producing just a carpellate or a staminate on a separate plant entirely. How do you like that? So some plants are just considered to be female plants, and some are considered to be male plants. So 2 houses. So one's a girl, one's a boy. How about that? What's an example of that? A date palm. So if you wanted to look that up, you can take a picture of that. I find this to be interesting is that all these different shapes and all these different patterns are really modifications to animals. Like I mentioned this before, they're sort of co-evolving with whatever the animal around is that's helping it pollinate. And so this is an example of a dioecious plant that's common in California. It's called coyote bush. It's found in chaparral along the coast, along the mountain. So this happens to be a carpellate, because you can see here these flowers are just female. So it's dioecious. So it's a girl coyote bush. And so look at this. Look at all the different kinds of flowers that have evolved over the last 130 million years of angiosperm history. And so I want to conclude with this little video clip here that shows this. It's going to show the scientist in a greenhouse, and he's getting very excited about this flower. I find it to be kind of cool.
Oh, look, people. How do you like that marvelous plant? That's a Dutchman's pipe. Now, let me tell you how this works. This is a classic example of plants that have weird pollination mechanisms. See the color? That chocolate color attracts flies. And the flies go there and say, good God, that wonderful thing there looks like something to eat. Now, the only bad news is that they have hairs down here. These hairs are all pointing downward, and he can't get out. And he flies around madly in there, and he gets all coated with pollen. And then at a given moment, and only the flower knows when that is, the hairs all shrivel. and he flies up all covered with pollen.
Incredible.
Once insects are covered in pollen, they carry it to another flower, and the process is repeated. Mechanisms like these help assure the survival of plants and, ultimately, the survival of other forms of life on Earth.
So that's great. I hope you enjoyed that beginning conversation of sexual reproduction and angiosperms. Thanks for watching.